I'm Christopher C. York, instructor of philosophy at Langara College.
And I'm Zan Plesner. I'm a student at Langara College.
And this is Synthesis and Sophistry. All right, here we are, Zan. We're talking about business ethics.
Yeah, that we are. So since this podcast is an educational platform and supplementary to Langara in some aspects,
loosely affiliated.
Yeah,
or at least that's where you came from.
Yeah.
We run these streets.
I guess today we're gonna cover a section from your business ethics class.
Sure, the global perspectives section. So just to quickly canvass the authors under our consideration, today we're going to be talking about Gillian Rice's article, Islamic Ethics and the Implications for Business, Gary Chan's The Relevance and Value of Confucianism in Contemporary Business Ethics, and Laszlo Zsolnai's Western Economics versus Buddhist Economics. So there's a whole, there's a platter of different theorists on offer today.
Yeah, so I guess to start out, why did you include this section in your business ethics course? What relevance does it have to philosophy?
Well, I suppose that, especially to business students, right, they're going to have to, at one point or another, run up against people, whether those are partners or clients or what have you, that will have different values than their own, and they'll have to have some sort of framework, if not for ranking those cultural values, and at least for understanding and tolerating them. So I'm assuming that for me, what this section does is gives business students a sort of rapid-fire introduction to several different possible ways of looking at the morality of making money through the lens of different cultural and religious systems.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So I guess on that first one, we'll tackle the first article here, Islamic Ethics and the Implications for Business. So what would you say is the main crux of this article?
It's pretty straightforward. Rice is giving us what she considers to be a sort of potted introduction to the Islamic Sharia law and the recommendations of that perspective to financial practices and business ethics. So to begin, right, she points out that the main aim of Sharia law is socio-economic justice and the satisfaction of material and spiritual needs. Now, you might think that because it's aimed at providing for the material needs of all, that it represents a sort of socialism. But we're assured that that is not the case. Caring for the poor is considered a moral duty, so there's no hoarding of resources allowed, and we have to distribute them justly if we adhere to the Sharia law. However, it's important to realize that under this schema, that the drive toward industriousness through the lure of private property is both acknowledged and encouraged. So it's not what Marx, I guess, denies, they are allowing, right? So, however, right, the drive towards producing material is permitted morally so long as it feeds back into the community. Yeah. So you can think about like Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations as the same kind of idea. Private greed is acceptable insofar as it tends towards the production of a surplus of goods that can then be redistributed to those who are needy. Yeah,
definitely. You can't just like hold on to your resources and Just to use an arbitrary example, maybe housing, if you were to hold on to that as an investment, that would be seen as morally wrong under this
Yeah,
context.
especially if there are people who are homeless in your community, right? And so that's the sort of key bit. The work of John Maynard Keynes is sort of noted in this consideration. The distinction between absolute and relative needs are made. So, Keynes says that there's a difference between absolute needs that are basically survival requirements and relative needs, which are more or less status-based wants. And this has a very close kinship to the Islamic business ethics, in that you're not allowed to pile up status-based wants materials before a sufficient stock of necessities are accumulated for the good of the community.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. One thing that I was curious about was, in the article, Rice says that it's emphasizes duty towards society rather than individual property rights. And I was wondering if that comes into conflict with our sort of Western ideal of liberal property rights and private property.
Yeah, it's surprisingly close to sort of practices of property acquisition in the West. It's based on John Locke's work, right, regarding like how we get to a position of private property from being in the state of nature. And this is covered on page 149 under the topic of trusteeship. Essentially what's being said there is very much in line with what we call the Lockean proviso, which is that no wasting of materials is morally allowable. So why is that? Okay, so in the state of nature, Locke says that we come to own things by mixing our labor with them, right? So that's kind of like the capitalist ethos of you go out there and you work your butt off and whatever you earn, you deserve. Because, damn it, you earned it. And so keep accumulating wealth, and that's fine. That's your right. However, right, John Locke is different than sort of like late-stage capitalism in this way. He says that you're only entitled to take as much as you can without it spoiling. So think about this, right? Let's say that you're collecting apples from an orchard. You're allowed to take as much as you can use and no more. So if you are very clever about it and you have like a basement where you can store the apples without them going bad, you can keep more apples. If you have a cider refinery, you can keep those apples. You can keep everything that you can use, and everything you use can kind of be fed back into the rest of, let's say, society generally. But as soon as those apples start to rot, you've done a bad thing. So kind of like what you're saying about the empty houses, sitting in Vancouver, for example, Locke would say that's, letting a resource spoil, and that is morally condemnable. You've broken law of nature, and so what's happening here with the Islamic ethics is very much the same. Like we are made by God in this example, trustees over the earth, and part of that responsibility of trusteeship, or what they call the Khalifa, is to use those resources wisely. Now, the question here, right, is how would you use an Islamic business ethics effectively to ensure that resources aren't wasted? And that's a bit of a thorny issue. Because in the article, right, they say, look, how do you apply a moral filter on the proper use of resources without using without a recourse to tyranny? So without taking control of society and imposing an Islamic moral filter, how do we get people to not waste resources? That's my puzzle for you. How do you do it?
Yeah, I mean, generally, I find, our current economic system to create a lot of waste in this sort of way. And this seems like a good alternative, but I guess that's where my trouble with the duty towards society approach rather than the rights approach comes in, because if you're in a system where you're incentivized to adhere only to those sort of rights, like the buck only stops at the rights, where the societal approach can be kind of a lot more loose and sidestepped in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, you can be legally entitled to something you're not morally entitled to, presumably. The answer of Rice here is through the Islamic approach is kind of interesting, right? So she says rather than appointing a tyrant or appointing someone to impose Sharia law, she says that you can lead by example and exert soft power. But obviously, this is not reliably practicable, right? In that, you can lead by moral example all you like, and somebody who's entrenched in their practices, they're under no, at least legal, compulsion to follow you. And so there's no guarantee you're going to get this kind of transformation of late-stage capitalism simply based on emphasizing Islamic virtues.
Yeah, and I mean, globally, generally, corporations and businesses are beholden to their shareholders, right? So under this, I think that also comes into conflict with that at some stages.
Yeah, and the shareholders, presumably the shareholders will have their own, let's say, moral systems that they adhere to, hopefully, and those may or may not be Muslim in orientation, right? So, I mean, there's no guarantee that the kind of trusteeship that's being advocated here can be applied in a non-Islamic setting. What's interesting, though, from this article, it does seem kind of, if I'm going to be critical about Rice, it seems not grounded in reality. I worked in the Middle East for 4 years, 2 years in Saudi Arabia and 2 years in Dubai. And especially in Saudi Arabia, where the Sharia law is most strictly applied, it wasn't a utopia of harmony and justice. It was quite the opposite. It was, from my perspective, dystopian in a lot of ways. So when I read the following passage on page 151, both Islamic and non-Islamic employees must be treated with the same just, equitable, and honest approach. That's nice on paper. But boy, oh boy, the workers from India and Pakistan who had their passports taken from them on arrival in Saudi Arabia and who were treated as, for all intents and purposes, a slave caste while in that country, and all the Filipino maids and stuff that you'd read about the horrendous abuses of human rights to them. I can't help but think that Gillian Rice's, let's say, I have to wonder how many years she spent in the Middle East, or at least in Saudi Arabia, to have the impression that this system is, let's say, the dominant ethical force in that region.
Yeah, and I guess this is my problem with all these articles in a way. It's the fact that they have these moral prescriptions, but really when it comes towards doing business, I think unless it's enforced through property rights or some sort of legal channel, then all these nice moral considerations we have are going to be sidestepped when it's convenient.
Yeah, of course, that doesn't mean we shouldn't have moral principles or even ideal ways of resolving issues. But the idea that you can take all of the ethical beliefs and practices of a culture and distill it into a 4-page brief and have that sort of tell the entire story, it's unrealistic. So again, these readings are a taster, and they have to be tasted with a bag of salt, not just a grain of salt, but a bag of salt, especially this one. So yeah, I think that it's interesting to read about sort of Islam in the abstract ideal form, and it's and perhaps a lot of common people still hold those beliefs to be true, and maybe they bind their behavior to them, but the people in power don't necessarily seem to have the same compunctions, right? So the idea that you don't need a government to enforce these laws, but you just need a good culture, ends up in institutions like the religious police, which, as far as I saw, the main occupation of the religious police in Saudi Arabia was to chase women and get them to cover their hair. So that's not, I wouldn't say it's a great contribution to the moral fiber of a community. In fact, it's just kind of, it's pestering, right? Yeah. So I don't know. I'm deeply, I guess that my life experience has made me deeply skeptical about the potential goods of just accepting what they called on page 149 under the virtue of unity, sort of God's natural law, as written down, in the Quran, as an eternal and binding law that can't be questioned, right? So the idea that we're going to reform capitalist practice with religious conservatism and legal absolutism,
yeah,
I'm dubious.
yeah, I agree. I think this is my skepticism of religious institutions in general holding authority. That's why there's the separation of church and state, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's a bad idea for Christians to control society just as much as the representatives of any other major religion, presumably, right? It leads to, I think, and it has historically led to intolerance, and it has led to persecution, and yes, let's say less than optimal decision making with regard to statecraft.
Mm. Yeah, I guess on my positive note for this, though, I do
bring the plane up. We're in a dive.
I do like the ideals that are put out here and the sense of responsibility and only using what you need, giving back to the community. Yes. I think that's all great.
Those are nice.
Yeah,
I like them too. If only we lived by them.
Yes.
Wouldn't life be better, Zan?
That's the problem, right?
Yeah. That being said, of course, there is value in highlighting these values. There's value in exploring these values. There's also value in lamenting how poorly they've been instituted in our cultural practice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you want to anything else here, or do you want to move on to the next article?
I guess we can move on and talk about Gary Chan's article now. Did you want to lead off with a question to help get us into the topic?
Okay, so the last article was talked about how business should be used in order to create social goods, and this article does the same thing, but emphasizes virtue and does this through a Confucian lens. So my question would be, what does this article say along those lines that is different from the other one?
Right. So, what Chan does is tries to make Confucianism understandable and palatable to the Western thinker via a sort of comparison to Aristotelian virtue ethics, which we're all, relatively aware of as philosophy students and philosophy instructors. And he does a fairly good job at doing that, right? He takes quotes from the Nicomachean Ethics, and he quotes Aristotle, for example, as writing, "We become just by performing right acts." This is on page 156. temperate by performing temperate ones, brave by performing brave ones. The moral virtues then are engendered in us neither by nor contrary to nature. We are constituted by nature to receive them, but their full deployment in us is due to habit. So in another article discussing Confucianism, I think this is by Mengqi, or Mencius as we might read him in English, he was describing basically the virtues as like seeds that, if given the proper environmental conditions, can grow from any person. This is his idea of the virtues. It's a bit like a agricultural analogy, I suppose. So if you find virtue difficult to realize in your own life and to exercise, it's probably that you're not being supported by your culture enough. So we all have the potential to be good, but not every seed is going to blossom necessarily. You might not have all the virtues, and if your life is unlucky enough, you might not have any of the virtues. So it's a bit like Aristotelian virtue ethics in that, right? And it says that if your life is so bad, so scarred, that your moral development can become impossible through no fault of your own. So it kind of bites that bullet, which I think is interesting. So from our sort of modern individualist point of view, I think that we tend to believe that anybody can pull themselves up by their bootstraps and, metaphorically water their own seeds to realize their potential, to become virtuous. But, Confucianism is a community-based virtue ethics. And so here, it takes it on the nose and says, look, you need the supporting elements to be in place for you to become a Confucian gentleman, or what Aristotle would call a virtuous agent, or the virtuous man.
Yeah. Under this one quote in the article on page 156, he says, the cultivation of the inner self is basically assessed by reference to one's external behavior. Yeah, so kind of that's in contrast to, I guess Aristotle also had that in it as well. But yeah, the contrasting to the individualistic approach, right?
I suppose it's moral behaviorism, right? We know, we can detect a virtue in you if you exhibit that virtue. If you don't do anything, we can't detect anything. And so from the Aristotelian point of view, mimesis becomes impossible, or any sort of frank analysis of your character. If you're inert, if you're a cyber limpet stuck to your computer and not exhibiting any behavior, then we have no way to sort of morally weigh your actions. Yeah. So it's a very active and embodied kind of morality. It's like I say, it's moral behaviorism. We can tell what kind of person you are by what you do.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess this relates to business ethics in that he says in this article that the interests of virtue always win over the economic interests that are at play, or should, in a virtuous person, right?
There's a primacy of benevolence over profit, right? Mm-hmm. As it's put. But that's not to say that Confucianism, again, is against profit making, right? But just like the Islamist ethics that we just discussed, profit is permissible and even desirable so long as the surplus is fed back into the community. Again, it's a communitarian, not an individualistic ethos. And so the author, Chan, tells us that Confucianism is therefore compatible with capitalism. It's just that the capital has to be used altruistically, which is, again, divergent from a lot of late-stage capitalist practices.
Yeah, so I found with this article, it's
compatible in theory.
Yeah.
But it doesn't fit with practice.
Yeah, he points at the end towards how Confucianism props up hierarchy and familial ties. And this made me think of, I have a friend who's Chinese Canadian, and he's gone back to China, and this is just from his own experience. I've never been there. I'm not very aware of the culture, but he was telling me that most people are very worried about their family and not so much the community. This was coming from him, but that was one problem, I guess, that I thought with this approach, that sort of hierarchy. And again, like how you were talking in Saudi Arabia, how these things are actually implemented in the real world. Again, this is just one person that was saying this. May or may not be true, but
yeah, no, I mean that's a complicated thing. So Confucianism comes from a time when life in China was simpler, right? It was before the Civil War and before the Communist Revolution, and I feel like that probably has a lot to do with explaining how the focus on community might get splintered, and it's replaced by devotion to the state. And that might also mean that in practice, where direct identification with the state's interests aren't possible, then you default to the familial unit. So I think that's probably a scaling issue to do with socio-political factors. If your friend is right. I mean, I've worked in China briefly, so I don't have the best insight, but I have some insight into what life is like there now. And once again, the theoretical values that are on paper here in the works of Chan don't really have much to do with the way that people really lived. For example, I don't know if I saw a lot of valuation of benevolence over profit. It's as the people there will tell you, it's a developing nation, and everybody is working real hard to make as much as they can while the economy is booming. It's not so different, I suppose, from life in a quickly developing capitalist country, right? So the socialism, I think, as I saw it, is more of a paper. It's an on-paper socialism, right? The lived reality, the felt reality, is very close to, at least to the foreigner, it's very close to Western capitalism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess another sort of critical aspect, or another aspect of this article that I'm critical of, is just pointing to virtue within a business ethics context leaves a lot of wiggle room and is very vague in its language. Like if I was to read this as someone in a management position, right, I would have no idea what to do with this.
Put it on your shelf next to The Art of War.
Yeah.
And, I think, again, you asked me what the relevance of these readings are to business students. And, I would say that it's just better to be aware that maybe some people see the world this way. There is an alternative way of looking at just the profit motive, right? There's ways to sort of weigh those considerations with moral values, and that this has been executed in different ways at different times with different concepts. And so I can't think of another time in a business student's life when they'll be asked to think about Buddhism, or Confucianism. But here we are, right? We're giving them the sampler platter of non-Western philosophies and worldviews. So I think that's of value. But again, where does the tire hit the pavement? It's tough to say. One thing about Confucianism is, or at least Neo-Confucianism, is that it is, let's say, very much supportive of hierarchies, filial piety. The power goes up in a chain. You know your place in society, and knowing your place is a virtue, and that tends towards the global virtue of harmony. So if you are trying to ascend the ranks of society improperly, you're being disharmonious and therefore immoral. You can see how that might tend towards an autocratic style of rule, with people not questioning it, very much. So in a way, there are certain kinds of, moral traditions which tend towards the installation of dictatorships, whereas others might tend against that. Now, where this comes out in business ethics is that it seems to recommend, this is on page 155, the concealment of wrongdoing by one's higher-ups. So no whistleblowing, and also nepotism. Hire your friends and family first. So this is these are ethical recommendations from Confucianism, which maybe they don't fit very well with Western best practice, Western business ethics, we'll say. We might have reasons to think this is dangerous. Like, think about this. If you are morally obligated to conceal the wrongdoing of your superiors, and you work at a nuclear power plant in Fukushima, there's an issue. You did the morally right thing, but now the entire Pacific seaboard is glowing green at night. There's a problem there, right? Like, these ethics were made for different times. And I think that, covering your family's misdoings in pre-industrial times has far fewer consequences than it does now. All the mistakes that we make are magnified in scope and impact, and the idea that we have a moral duty to cover up the worst possible acts just because they're committed by members of our family or close friends seems like it's dangerous.
Yeah, I guess maybe just to push back a little bit, like,
sure.
In our culture, maybe we just have different flavors of these sort of things. Like, nepotism, I think, is hugely important in our business relationships.
We have a word for nepo babies, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And the old boys club.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, there's different ties and branches of loyalty that we have over here.
Yeah, I'm not saying the West is exempt from any of these charges, and it's worse in a lot of ways, right? It's morally bankrupt and nihilistic in a lot of ways. So, bear in mind that when we're picking apart these articles and these belief systems, we're not thereby being apologists for any other competing system. Humans be humans, and humans do bad things. So,
yeah. I didn't mean to imply that you were being intellectually dishonest in any sort of way. I just to point out that.
No, that's fair. I think on balance, it's good to hear us also take disparaging shots at Westerners, and I think for our dedicated listener base, of which there are numbers, you'll find that every other week we're taking out Western thinkers and we're giving them the shakedown. So this week we're just we're exporting our unique brand of critique to other kinds of ideologies. All right. Well, I guess the only other thing I want to point out about this article, which was maybe it's the only thing that's news to me since I've studied Confucianism before a little bit in Japan, is this point by Mencius or Mengshi. He writes, Mo advocated universal love, which means a denial of the special relationship with the father. To deny the special relationship with the father is to become an animal. If the principles of Mo are not stopped, and if the principles of Confucius are not brought to light, perverse doctrines will delude the people and obstruct the path of humanity and righteousness. When humanity and righteousness are obstructed, beasts will be led to devour on men, and men will devour one another. Now, this is this passage. So for those who haven't read the article or who have yet Mo is a theorist who advocates universal love. So in other words, not giving one's friends and family that particular place of privilege that Confucianism does. And I just like to read Mengshi this sort of rhetorical lambasting of Mo. is something I found kind of, well, one, scary, but also kind of delightful in its kind of overstated prose.
I think Ming-Chi's got daddy issues.
Got to respect the daddy. But what would he make of hippies, right? I mean,
yeah.
Meng-Chi would he's had it with them.
Just scowl at them.
Men are devouring each other. The beast will be next.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's just a charming passage. It has very little to do with the majority of the article, but this is fairly, let's say, I wouldn't say it's grim stuff, but it's stuff that we can use a little bit of a respite from. So I just wanted to point that out as a little flavor.
Yeah.
So once again, we have another communitarian ethos that is not necessarily incompatible with capitalism, but certainly tries to show that the current capitalist practice needs reform if it's going to be morally acceptable by Confucianist lights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So do you want to move on to Buddhism now?
Yeah, let's talk about Zsolnai's article. Any questions about the article to kick us off?
I don't know if this is one we want to start out with or maybe come back to later, but no, you know what? Let's come back to it later. It'll come up.
It's a cliffhanger. Stay tuned, folks.
Yeah, I guess my question here, maybe just a pitching question. How does the Western concept of the self versus the Buddhist concept of the self inform these two conceptions of economics?
Right. According to Zsolnai, Western economics is dominated by what he calls egonomical considerations, which is the satisfaction of the ego. It's self-interest driven and anthropocentric, right? It's all about people and what people want. This is contrasted with the Buddhist idea of anatta, which is the letting go of the ego as an illusion. And the idea that the proper focus of the human is more on a cosmic scale, right? And so seeing the self as being relatively meaningless in comparison with the big picture of the universe. And so we have to let go of our ego. If we cling on to the idea that we are this singular entity that persists through time, it's going to lead to dysfunction in your life. And so we're better off without it. I mean, I'm going to read a quote here. This is on page number 157. Anatta specifies the absence of a supposedly permanent and unchanging self in any one of the psychophysical constituents of empirical existence. That's a big sentence. Let's talk about that. Psychophysical constituents of empirical existence. So, in other words, there's no part of us that persists permanently throughout time, right? And we know that, right? You're not the same you that you were when you were a baby, and you're not, God willing, you're not the same person you'll be when you die, right? Your atoms will be replaced. Your thoughts are non-identical. Your emotional states are completely different. Everything changes, right? Therefore, what is normally thought of as the self is an agglomeration of constantly changing physical and mental constituents, which give rise to unhappiness if clung to, as though this temporary assemblage represented permanence. The Anatta doctrine attempts to encourage Buddhist practitioners to detach themselves from the misplaced clinging to what is mistakenly regarded to as self, and from such detachment, aided by moral living and meditation, the way to nirvana can be successfully traversed. So, that sounds nice. I'd like that. Right?
Yeah.
I want to worry less.
Meditate more.
There we go. Problem solved. But to dictate, or to give us a roadmap of how to get to nirvana, right? We have the four noble truths of the Buddha that are laid out for us. I'll just quickly review them. Number 1, life is suffering. Number 2, the cause of suffering is desire. Number 3, the cessation of suffering is the cessation of desire. And number 4, the path to the cessation of desire requires practice. So, let's go through them one at a time. Is life suffering, Zan?
Yes.
Good. All right, we're done. Well, I mean, even if we have relatively privileged lives, I would say at least some of our existence is the experience of some sort of pain. Maybe not direct physical pain. It might be existential angst or emotional anguish. But to live is to suffer. To put it differently, it's also to enjoy. Right? So it's a bit one-sided, but definitely suffering is in the mix there. The cause of suffering is desire. This one we might have more issue with, right? So I would say that's one cause of suffering. Do you want to know another cause of suffering, Zan?
What's that?
Dropping a big rock on my foot. And that's not the product of my desire. Mm-hmm. Right? That's just a big rock on my foot.
Yeah. I think like I have a little bit of understanding of Buddhism more than Confucianism and Islam.
So you're going to say more than you.
No.
More than you. Which is possible.
So some people
absolutely possible
have proposed that suffering maybe isn't the best translation. Dissatisfaction is a translation that some people have said. So maybe it doesn't change the rock analogy too much.
Yeah. How can I be satisfied with a rock crushing my foot, Zan?
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
I'm satisfied.
I
have everything I need.
I guess this would be, yeah. Maybe desire doesn't encapsulate everything.
Yeah, I mean, here's where like my understanding of Confucianism and probably is Islamic ethics probably is deeper than my understanding of Buddhist morality. So this is me just being a philosopher looking at the printed word in the page without having reference to deeper teachings of Buddhist scriptures or what have you. So I know there is a principled answer to this, but I just think it's funny to think that the cause of all suffering is desire. I think maybe you say a cause of suffering is desire. Mm-hmm. I'll let you slide. You say the cause, the definitive cause of all suffering is just desire. Well, then I'm going to say, hold on now. Surely you're not thinking about this, right-headedly. But in any case, we'll let it slide. My philosophical objection has been noted. Let's move on to the noble truth. Number 3, the cessation of suffering is the cessation of desire. So, again, see number 2.
Yeah.
And number 4, the path to the cessation of desire requires practice. That I don't have any, a priori philosophical objections to, right? I think, training yourself to want less is part of what it means to become a mature person. And I do think it requires self-control, which requires practice. So I think that I agree with the noble truth, number 4.
This is completely off topic, but I'm reading the Bell Jar right now by Sylvia Plath, and she talks about a fig tree in it as a metaphor for her life, where she's seeing all these different branches shooting out, and these are all the different choices and paths she can go down in her life, and each one that she takes, all the others fall away and rot, and she's left there sitting at the bottom of the tree looking at all the figs rotting because she can't decide. This relates to desire in that she desires so many things at once, so abundantly that it brings her a great deal of suffering through this, where if she was just able to minimize her desires into one, then this form of suffering would cease to exist, is where I was going with that. But
I'm reminded of something as well, Zan. There's the fable of the dog and the bone. Have you heard this one?
No, I haven't.
So this dog, he's got a bone and it's really juicy and he's enjoying it, and he's walking over a bridge. And he looks down with the bone in his mouth. You know what he sees in the water, Zan?
A dog with a bone.
Dog with a bone. He's jealous. He wants that bone too, and he He wants to scare that dog, so he opens up his mouth and he tries to bark at that dog.
Mm.
Then guess what happens, Zan?
Drops the bone in the water.
No bones.
Yeah.
All desire, no payoff.
Yeah.
And so if he had learned the Four Noble Truths, if he was in control of his desires, he would still have that one bone, and he would be satisfied. In the words of Alanis Morissette, I do not want what I do not have.
Yeah.
Dog could have learned that. Dog should have read this chapter.
All right. Literary references out of the way. We'll just cut that whole section.
I don't think we have. I think it's fine.
Yeah. We'll
leave
trim it up.
Leave it. Juice it up in post.
Yeah.
Yep.
So.
Yep.
What is the significance that desire plays in this article? Because and how it's connected to Western economics.
Right. So there are some, let's say, principles of Buddhist economics, which Zsolnai lays out, and the first of which is minimizing suffering. Although if you think that all life is suffering, by minimizing suffering, I guess you're minimizing life. Gotcha. No, but, so I'm assuming that even though if you say life is suffering, you still want to get to nirvana, which is the cessation of suffering. So if you want to sort of, it is a bit forced, but I think he's trying to extract some sort of relevance to business ethics from Buddhist principles. And so the minimization of suffering does seem to be it's a felicitous aim. It's in line with Buddhist teachings. And so just avoid forms of business which create unnecessary suffering. Seems good.
Cool.
Fine. The next principle of Buddhist economics is a bit more complicated. It requires us to simplify our desires. And so I'm going to read a quotation here from page 158, which sort of puts some flesh on these bones. Zsolnai makes reference to studies that document that strong materialistic values are associated with pervasive undermining of people's well-being, from low life satisfaction and happiness to depression and anxiety, to physical problems such as headaches, and to personality disorders, narcissism, and antisocial behavior. To continue a bit, psychologists call the mechanism through which people seek to satisfy their desires auto-projection. It is a loser strategy, in italics, whether or not people achieve their desired goals. When they are not able to reach the goals they envision, they attribute their continuing dissatisfaction to their failure to reach the alleged corrective measures. So here it's a bit like there's a cycle of desire creation and the pursuit of the means by which that desire can be fulfilled, but then you just want something else at the end of that process, and so there's a never-ending cycle of desires replacing each other and becoming more, I would say, probably psychologically taxing as they accumulate. So if you want something simple, like a dog with a bone, and you get that, that's fine. But then you want a bigger bone, or 2 bones, or whatever, and that starts to cause trouble for you, right? And you should refer back to our previous articles, right? You might want to reduce the sphere of things you desire to the realm of things that are strictly necessary, right? And maybe you don't even desire those, but you acknowledge that you need them to survive. And so that does seem like a spiritual practice, right? He says that, and again, the same page, 158, he says, wanting less could bring substantial benefits to the person, right? Because you experience less anxiety in not getting what you want. For the community, in that they don't have to listen to you, be dissatisfied, with wanting things. And I guess also it reduces conflict within the community because we could both want the same thing. If we both desire the same object, we're going to come into conflict with each other. And so it's better if, to reduce the chances of that happening, we have the most modest, let's say, framework of desires that's possible while still living. And finally, for nature, right? So nature famously is what's called a primordial stakeholder here. In other words, something that's affected by business practice that can't actually speak out for itself. And obviously, you think about like the rainforests in Brazil being bulldozed to make grazing, fields for cattle and whatnot. If the desires of especially people living in the West, where we consume those resources, were tampered somewhat, this environmental degradation would be not stopped but slowed considerably.
Yeah, and I guess I was curious because capitalism creates new desires, right? It gives us more to desire than we would in a simpler time through advertising and new products and, keeping up with the Joneses, all that. I'm curious, is this framework that, what's the, Zola? No. Zsolnai. This framework that Zsolnai puts out, is this compatible with capitalism? Because I'm not sure if it is, because it's saying, here, I have a quote here. Buddhist economics does not aim to build an economic system of its own. Rather, it represents a strategy which can be applied in any economic setting at any time. It helps to create livelihood solutions that reduce the suffering of all sentient beings through the practice of want negation, nonviolence, caring, and generosity. So I'm not sure that it is compatible with any economic system because of this minimalization.
That quote's on page 160, by the way, and I think you can see what Zan's talking about if you look at the graphic on the top of the page, where there's a direct comparison between modern Western economics and Buddhist economics, right? Where, and again, I guess Zan can maybe take us through that.
Yeah. So on the modern Western economics, we have maximize profits. The Buddhist minimize suffering, maximize desires. On the Western side, minimize desires, maximize market, minimize violence, maximize instrumental use, minimize. So just everything is more minimal rather than maximizing things.
Right, that's exactly right. Zsolnai calls Buddhism a minimizing framework and calls capitalism a maximizing framework. So these do seem to be incompatible paradigms. So then the question raises itself, can we apply the principles of Buddhist economics to capitalism? We could, but it doesn't, these actions, right, of minimizing suffering, simplifying desires, and practicing nonviolence, all these values come from outside of capitalism. They come from a different source. So if you wanted to, you could hybridize the two, but there are it will cause probably some cognitive dissonance and some strain as you try to square this circle.
Kind of seems like trying to cook an egg with a wrench to me, but
yeah, I mean, I guess that you could say that you could make a modified or restricted capitalism. You could have like a capitalist system with Buddhist restrictions, but there's going to be points where if you try to adhere to that, your gears are going to grind at a certain point. And I can't tell you in advance what that point will be, but your values will definitely be in tension with each other.
Yeah. Again, I guess maybe one thing that I think about this is you might just need to have a very strong legal framework or regulations and oversight over the free market in order for any of this to really come about.
And that's not going to be to the liking of capitalists, right? So if you're Milton Friedman, you're not going to want any state controls in place beyond the bare minimum, and a state control on economic growth that makes everybody conform to a certain set of moral principles is going to be a very hard sell to anybody who believes that the free market ought to operate according to the dictates of the invisible hand and not much else.
I guess too, you brought up economic growth. Does this allow for economic growth?
Right.
I'm not sure.
Yeah. I mean, like I said about the other two attempts to bring in ancient values into contemporary capitalist context, it works better with a small agrarian community rather than a modern technological state. So yes, you can see how, like, not wanting too much, minimizing suffering, and not hurting your neighbor, and practicing nonviolence, all those work really well, down on the farm or in your small village with your family. You blow that up to the global stage, and you're trying in the capitalist system to provide as many goods as at greater prices you can charge for them across multiple nations. Some eggs are going to break as you try to open them with that wrench, right? Or cook them with that wrench. I mean, I'm going to say that economic growth necessarily produces casualties of various kinds. And so everything that we're enjoying now in the lap of late-stage capitalism is bought at a moral price. Could we make our practice of consumption less morally objectionable by going back to Buddhist principles? Yes. Would this require a radical cultural transformation in order to occur?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert. Yes. So, once again, nice thoughts, nice values, interesting conceptual schema, prospects for applying it to contemporary business practice, not great. I mean, I assume that law is what binds business practice, right? So law will practice nonviolence insofar as it doesn't violate local laws or industrial regulations. I'm assuming that it has nothing to do with, again, except where the law intervenes, minimizing suffering, not really on the table for business. Now, I said before in class once, I believe, that if pork producers found that they could raise a sort of species of hog that lacked the capacity to feel pain, but the bacon was 20% less tasty, that they would not use that species of hog to make bacon. They would prefer the species that suffered and the bacon that sold better. And so I'm assuming that capitalist principle means that the Buddhist ideal of minimizing suffering isn't on the table, again, except where it's legislated. And finally, the idea that we should simplify our desires, that does seem anti-capitalist directly. Yeah. Right? Capitalism is all about the creation of new desires constantly. Yeah. This year's fashion, the latest action figure or doll. I want to see this new Broadway production. I want to go to this country, to this new spa. All these things, all these desires that would never even occur to people who lived a simpler form of life, pre-industrial revolution. It'd be completely beyond the scope of possibility. And you might think that, well, lucky us, these things are no longer beyond the scope of possibility. We can reach out and pluck these from the ether, these goods that were inaccessible to previous generations. But then we have to think about the cost. And a lot of people have paid a lot to get where we are now. And people are still suffering, right? There's a huge disparity in how goods are consumed by people in various parts around the world. And here's where, if you want to, we can bring in the criticism of the West, right? So the West is riding high on this history of imperialism and colonialism, and still relatively comfortable sitting in its nest of ill-gotten gains and reluctantly giving some back here and there. What can the West say in its defense other than it was ambitious, right? It can't hide itself behind Christian values, right? It can't say that there's some sort of ethos of brotherhood that justifies the exploitation of indigenous people all the world over, and the opportunism that they availed themselves of in every possible way at every time that it offered itself. So, yeah, just to bring the criticism back home to the West, we do not have clean hands either by a very long stretch. So we don't even have an entry in this section. We can't even tout ourselves as having these highfalutin values.
Yeah.
Right? That are inapplicable because, again, in a lot of people who practice business are just going to say, look, we have values that we stick on the wall. We hope employees wash their hands before they handle after they come back from the washroom and they handle your hamburger. But that's only because, we have laws regarding, employee hygiene that we're trying to not run afoul of. Yeah. It's not because we value our customer as a moral agent whose, dignity has to be respected. It's because, if they get sick, they're going to sue us. We don't want that. So wash the crap off your hands before you bread the chicken fillet. Right?
Yeah.
Sorry, I was soapboxing again.
No. That's fine. Yeah, I guess just to kind of start wrapping things up. One thing I was thinking about is
don't wrap things up. Don't wrap things up. Zan puts me in a box for a week between podcasts. I'm only allowed out to soapbox for an hour.
This is never going to make it on the final cut.
Don't take me away. Don't put me back in the box, Zan. Okay, to wrap up.
Yeah. At least the first two articles. I could see, like we've kind of touched upon a few times, like in earlier, simpler times, these affecting, like, I think in order to get these implemented in any sort of meaningful way, you need a cultural hegemony. And in the West, we just don't have that at all. And I think as globalization happens, there's less of that. So yeah, for me, I don't see this having a lot of prescriptive value, but like you said, I think it's always good to learn about other people's cultures and understand where they're coming from. And for that's where I find the value in these contributions.
Right. I mean, in any community with reasonable pluralism of inhabitants divided amongst different cultures and religions and backgrounds, installing El Sharia law is going to be a tough sell, I think. Right? So, and there's no privileged place, at least in the liberal democratic West, where you can say one religious tradition or set of interests has sway over all others. This set of values is better than that set of values, right? To rank them that way would be to be culturally imperialist. And it's no better to be a Western cultural imperialist than an Islamic cultural imperialist or vice versa, right? So all we can do is sort of create this framework where we can reasonably tolerate each other's differences, and maybe put some sort of minimal set of regulations in place so that we don't destroy the planet while we do that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I guess just on that point, again, capitalism is the economic system that liberalism has. So in order to, hold these liberal values, it seems that the capitalist system is not completely compatible with these cultural norms always.
Right. There's a tension there. But for those of you who are interested in pursuing this further, in 2 weeks, we'll be looking at the topic of environmental responsibility. So we might find other ways to sneak in pro-environmental values that aren't based on religion. More secular kinds of interests might be brought into play in order to appeal to the rational self-interest of the dedicated capitalist. Stay tuned.
All right. Till next time. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Sam.